Like this excites me, this talking about this, where we can develop these isotopes in nuclear reactors, and we can alter their chemistry and inject them, or have somebody ingest these radionuclides that has cancer, for example, and that chemistry of it can make it to where it binds to specifically where that cancer is and kills the cancer. So you're right, it does kill. It kills the cancer cells.
The Rational View is a weekly series hosted by me, Dr. Alan Scott, providing a rational, evidence-based perspective addressing important societal issues. Hello and welcome to The Rational View. I'm your host, Dr. Al Scott. In this episode, Nuclear Power. Is it rational to worry? This episode is part one of a two-part interview I've done with DJ LeClear, radiation expert, talking about radiation and nuclear power. DJ has been in nuclear power and radiation health physics since his enlistment in the Naval Nuclear Program, where he did radiochemistry and radiation protection aboard the USS Harry S. Truman. Currently, he works in health emergency preparedness as a technical expert for radiation hazards. He has a Bachelor of Science in Nuclear Engineering Technology, and he is enrolled in the Health Physics Master's Program at Illinois Institute of Technology. In his spare time, he practices science communication by running the Facebook page, The Pragmatic Environmentalist, and his new YouTube channel, The Rad Guy. DJ LeClear, welcome to The Rational View.
Well, thank you for having me.
So, what was your career path and how did you become a radiation safety expert?
Well, it all started out when I was in the Navy in their nuclear program, as an engineering laboratory technician doing radiological controls, steam plant chemistry, radiochemistry, and that was definitely the beginning of my interest in radiation and nuclear power as well, being an operator in their plants. And once I got out, definitely still had a major interest in it. So then I actually worked on analytical X-ray equipment for a while, which is definitely, it's very radiation related. But I eventually finished, while I was working, my nuclear engineering technology degree, and definitely kept up my interest in nuclear. And eventually I started working as a nuclear engineer for the state of Wisconsin. And definitely it was interesting because I thought I knew a lot when I was in the Navy, getting out of the Navy and learning everything they taught me. And then I got into the kind of the real world of radiation and really just broadened my knowledge once I got out and realized I really didn't know as much as I thought I did, but definitely made me even more interested, I think, in radiation, broadening my knowledge on it. And so I eventually decided that I would get my master's in health physics. And I have my health physics master's that I'm currently working on is at Illinois Institute of Technology, and it's specifically focused on emergency preparedness and radiological security, because that's kind of what I do right now with my current position. And I could explain what that all is if you want me to.
Well let's just back up
a
second and maybe start a little more basic. Could you give our listeners maybe a brief intro into what is radiation and where it comes from?
Absolutely. So radiation, I mean, it comes in two different physical forms, really. So you got your radiation that's electromagnetic radiation, something I think we're all actually more familiar with than a lot of people think, and that's basically light. That light is radiation, and light is just a specific energy of radiation, a specific wavelength. And if you go lower energy, that's kind of your infrared, and then your You have your microwaves and your radio. Those are less energetic than the light you can see. And then you start getting just beyond that energy level that you can see, and you get into your ultraviolet radiation. And at the high end of the ultraviolet spectrum is when you start getting to that point where radiation has enough energy where it can start removing electrons from elements, and that's called ionizing radiation. So you go beyond that and much higher energy. So you got your ultraviolet, your X-rays, gamma rays, and it just goes higher and higher energy. So that's the kind of that. Typically, when people are talking about radiation, they're talking about that higher energy ionizing radiation when it comes to electromagnetic radiation. And then there's that other physical manifestation of radiation, and it's particle radiation. And that right there is you have beta particles, alpha particles, neutrons, protons. There's a lot of different particles out there. But basically, it's just matter with energy. But that's kind of very basic what is radiation.
Okay. And where does it come from? I mean, it's not just from nuclear power plants, right? Obviously the sun is giving us light, but I mean, radiation is natural. We're experiencing it all the time, right?
Yes, absolutely. So a common thing that you'll hear people in the radiation field say is like, basically we live in we're surrounded by radiation. We live in a sea of radiation, and like every moment of your life you have just hundreds and thousands of particles passing through you of radiation. And when you're talking about your natural sources of radiation that are ionizing specifically, the ones that we have are ones that come from space, basically either coming from the sun or coming from outside of our solar system. Your cosmic radiation is what we call it. Those are going to be, you have your gamma, your high energy electromagnetic radiation, as well as protons is actually a big one, proton radiation. And then that's a big part of it, but we're protected a lot from our atmosphere. So if you go beyond our atmosphere, your dose of radiation would go a lot higher. And then other natural sources would be just from the ground. All around you, there are radionuclides. Those are specific elements that have a radioactive component to them. So they're unstable, and when they decay to a more stable form, they release radiation, both gamma and beta, alpha radiation. And that's going to be in a common one is your granite that has a lot of uranium in it. And I think one thing that your viewers would be very familiar with is radon. And radon actually comes from uranium, which is in granite. It's one of the daughter products of uranium, which means basically uranium, it'll release an alpha particle, will turn into another element, which will release another particle and turn into another element, and eventually you'll get to radon, which is a gas, right? And it can fill into your basements. So that's another really common one. It just comes from the soil and all around us. Another big one is bananas. Those have potassium in it, and a percentage of that potassium is actually potassium-40, which is a radioactive version of potassium. And so every time you eat a banana, you get a dose of radiation. Potatoes, that's another big one. A lot of potassium in those. Potato chips are actually some of the most radioactive things that we eat. Because they have a lot of potassium in them. Well, I mean, we'll definitely talk about that. It's definitely not something to be concerned about at all when it comes to the amount of radiation you're getting from those sources.
One thing I read recently was that you get a lot of radiation from smoking tobacco. apparently the big leaves of
Yep.
the tobacco plants absorb the radon gas, and they kind of have like some hair on them, and the radon gas will get trapped in these leaves, and then will get rolled up into cigarettes.
Yep. Yep. I remember I tried looking into this as well, but one of the things they always taught us or they taught me through my time in the Navy nuclear power program was that you got like 1 rem of dose per year for a heavy smoker or like fairly heavy smoker. And that's about 3 times what you would normally get from natural background sources just from smoking alone. So you would add 3 times as much more to it. But
another thing that I know about from my background, at least, is from space. You know, you have the magnetic fields around the Earth protect the Earth, but there's a lot of radiation particles that circulate in these magnetic fields, and these are called the Van Allen belts. And if you go up in an airplane and you go up above most of the atmosphere, you're much less protected from the space radiation. You get cosmic rays coming into you, and you can get a significant dose of radiation just in going on a transatlantic flight.
Yep. Oh yeah. I'm actually well known to pretty much every time I go fly, I bring a detector with me, and definitely it's a big conversation starter. I remember one long flight that I had. I talked for 2 hours straight with the flight attendants. They actually invited me to the back, and we just had a real long conversation. It was awesome.
Nice.
Yeah.
And it's also one of the biggest risks of astronauts going to other planets or the moon is the space radiation dose that they can get is quite significant once you get outside the radiation belts. So let's move on maybe, and if you could describe the risks of radiation exposure from health standpoint.
Yeah. So in our normal lives, even though we do live in a sea of radiation, radiation really is the least of our concerns, especially when you're talking about all the other risks that we deal with in our normal daily life, basically like risks of driving, risks of taking a shower. Like there's so many other things that we really need to worry about. That radiation, it sounds way scarier than it really is, and that's because radiation is a pretty weak carcinogen. Basically, you have to have a lot of it for one thing, a large dose of it to even be able to get a measurable increase in your health risks. They've seen this in epidemiological studies, basically, and you have to have a fairly high dose. Well, it's significantly higher than background in order to actually have increase in health effects. But even if you did get to that point where you can measure it, it's still not a dramatic increase in your risks. There's a lot of other things that we deal with that do have a much higher risk that we really should be dealing with. But even that level that I mentioned, that we have measurable evidence for risk, there's not that many cases where that happens, if that makes any sense.
Now what you're saying, I understand what you're saying, but I've also heard it said, and a lot of the regulations that I see about safe doses are based on the fact that there's no safe dose of radiation. You know, people say that any radiation can cause cancer.
So that kind of goes into how we regulate. It's way simpler to basically take those risks that we've measured before at those high levels of radiation and extrapolate all the way down to zero, basically. It makes it a lot simpler to do your regulation. Yeah, but the thing is, we don't have any evidence for it at those really low levels. We can measure a possible hypothetical risk, but and it's quite possible that risk is even there, but it's so small that it's negligible.
I understand extrapolating, like linear
Yeah.
extrapolation, and I've heard the
Mm-hmm.
term linear no threshold being bandied
Mm-hmm.
about on the internet for describing the prediction of these low dose effects
Mm-hmm.
of
Mm-hmm.
radiation exposure for cancer, for example.
Yeah, and so there's a lot of things that go on to your cells when it comes to, or when they receive a radiation dose, that we've just learned in the last 20 or so years. Like, well, maybe a little more than that. 80s and 90s, we've learned so much, and into this century. And we know that when you get down to really low doses, things do change and how your body kind of responds to those lower doses. And honestly, it leaves a lot more questions than it answers when you start learning about these things. I could start getting into the very specifics, but it's quite technical. But I always kind of ascribe to the fact that the risks are so low that it shouldn't be of a concern to us. I mean, there's a risk of oxygen, there's a risk of drinking water. There's risks to all sorts of things that are actually necessary.
All these things are things that can create mutations in your DNA that then can lead to cancer. Is that what you're describing?
Maybe not water, but oxygen can. Yes. So the other things that we deal with in just a normal everyday, or in our normal everyday lives, comes with cancer risk. Like not everything, but a lot of things that are good for your health are carcinogenic. If especially if you have too much of it, and then you start seeing, like I said, those measurable increases of your risk. Alcohol is a big one, huge one actually. That's very carcinogenic, but we drink that in excess, and with no worry. But
Yes, we do.
yes, yes.
The one analogy I like to use is that radiation is the same as getting a sunburn. Effectively, it's
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
basically the same effect and the same sort of mechanism for having the potential to get cancer. And people go out and sit in the sun all the time.
Yep, yep. And or not all the time, but you should get sun exposure, because of the health benefits that you're getting from both being outside and the vitamin D and everything. So that we know that we need it, and that not having it is a health risk in itself. But if it is carcinogenic in the exact same manner that radiation is, in fact, because it's your ultraviolet radiation, and it's using that same mechanism on your cells, and this exact same thing as getting radiation. And that's a big thing when I'm talking about risks is, right, well, you do go outside, right, and you do expose yourself to the sun. You expose yourself to ultraviolet radiation that's basically causing the same effects as ionizing radiation, specifically to your skin. You're getting a dose.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, and you wouldn't purposely 100% avoid that. You would not want to.
In fact, I've also heard people arguing that some low doses of radiation are actually good for the body. There was an article where people were using
Mm-hmm.
radiation of X-rays to mitigate pneumonia from COVID, for example. People are getting a chest X-ray, and it actually helped the body to recover from COVID.
Yeah. Radiation in the medical field is just, it is such a major technology that we've gotten into. It is amazing how many lives have been saved from radiation in the medical field. Like you said, for the COVID-19 treatment, where it's a dose to the lungs. That's big. Like, you could actually save people's lives that way, and that's just the barely scratching the surface when it comes to how much radiation is used for cancer treatment, diagnosis. I mean, those are the two big ones. Your diagnosis and your cancer treatment. There are so many lives that are saved due to radiation.
How does the radiation help you? Because I thought radiation basically just kills cells.
Yeah, so it's so cool the things we can do. Like this excites me, just talking about this, where we can develop these isotopes in nuclear reactors, and we can alter their chemistry and inject them, or have somebody ingest these radionuclides that has cancer, for example, and that chemistry of it can make it to where it binds to specifically where that cancer is and kills the cancer. So you're right, it does kill. It kills the cancer cells, and we've gotten so much better and better at it that we're able to make it specifically target where that cancer is located with a pretty heavy dose of radiation. And that's a really major thing that they do at medical facilities when it comes to using radiation in cancer treatment. There's another example that I really love is you can use proton therapy, where basically you take a stream of protons and you're directing it at a person's tumor. And what's really cool about proton therapy is we can make it to where the energy is deposited almost exclusively in the tumor, and you're not damaging. Well, you're damaging maybe a little bit, but not much at all. You're mostly damaging the tumor itself and killing those tumor cells. So that's a big area where radiation is used to save people's lives. And then also in diagnosis, and that's a big thing for saving people's lives as well.
Yeah, it's amazing and ironic. I mean, people think of it as a destructive force, but it really is being used for healing more than anything. Now, I've heard of a term, the Hormesis effect. And the Hormesis effect is basically a refutation of the linear no threshold extrapolation, which is, we know that there's cancer that's caused at very high doses, and we're just going to extrapolate down to very low doses and predict a certain cancer rate. But there's no medical data behind this, and this is what the precaution that all the regulations are based on. And now what we're seeing is that people are studying lower doses of radiation in people who live in high background areas, and finding that these people actually they live longer, and that the low doses of radiation actually stimulate some processes in the cells which cause healing to occur. And they're not at all more at risk of cancers than as would be predicted in the linear no threshold theorem. Are you familiar with this theory?
Oh, yes, I am. Very controversial, as you probably already know. And so I kind of alluded to it a little bit before when it comes to when we started doing more research into those lower doses of radiation and kind of the things that happen when you get to those lower doses to cells. And there is absolutely evidence for hermetic effects at low doses when it comes to doing things in a lab, basically with cells and with mice or rats, I can't remember. But there's also some things that leave some questions. So it's hard to say that there would be a consensus on that, but there's definitely something there. I would not hang my hat on it yet, just because I'm still looking for more evidence on it. Okay. But we definitely know something at those lower levels. It's much. There's other things happening.
It seems to be stimulating some healing in the body.
Yes. So I'll get into it. Basically, they know that you basically can kind of prime your cells to prepare it for a large dose of radiation by giving it a large dose of radiation kind of thing. Yeah, it's kind of interesting, actually. Which possibly, like, maybe if we do a little more research into it, could be something for people who go to space, right? That they're about to get a fairly large dose of radiation. If you can basically prime their cells to be ready to get that dose by using radiation, that could be beneficial for people, astronauts. So
yeah, the body seems to adapt to different levels of background radiation because obviously and this is something probably evolutionary, because there's all sorts of different levels on Earth depending on where you live, and people can live in very high radiation areas with no bad effects if they've been there for a while.
Yep, one big one that comes to mind is Ramsar, Iran, that has a large background radiation that you get from the Earth there, and I know it's a fairly small cohort or small group of people, so it's hard to make a lot of conclusions about it. But I know that there's definitely not negative effects from it. But I have heard from there and some other places where it's like, oh, maybe it seems like maybe there's some benefit there. But it's such small sample sizes. It's hard to, again, like I said, like hang my hat on that. But yeah,
interesting.
Yeah.
So we're going to pause here and end part 1 of my interview with DJ LeClear, radiation expert, and we'll take this up next week where we discuss more of the relationship between radiation and nuclear power and how it affects people and whether nuclear energy is a risk to society or not. I hope you stay tuned. I'm just going to give you a little teaser here so you can hear some of the stuff that we're going to talk about. Thank you for listening to The Rational View.
They're like, oh, but nuclear waste lasts for so long. I'm like, but other industries, it lasts forever. Like, people don't think about that. Nuclear waste gets better over time. It gets less hazard over time. But people don't seem to think about that. But if other industries were all required to take into account for all of their waste that they generated, we wouldn't have climate change. It wouldn't be a thing.
If you're enjoying what you're hearing, please consider visiting my Patreon page and becoming a patron of this podcast at patron.podbean.com/TheRationalView.